that same debt?
Well, that's a good question. I think obviously the government is a purchaser of energy too, right? I mean, the government produces things. It has a massive fleet of automobiles. So the reduction in gas prices should bring down the cost of government, and it should help bring the deficit down. But this gentleman raised a really important point, because people always get confused about this, the difference between the deficit and the debt. So the deficit is the annual amount of borrowing that we're doing, and this gentleman is right. We're at about $500 billion a year right now, which, by the way, is still an atrocious number. We're still borrowing over $1 billion a day in the United States, so we've got to balance our budget. But the debt is the cumulative amount of these deficits, and the debt right now is above $18 trillion, and I find that to be very troubling. The biggest debtor in the world today is the United States government, and the thing to worry about, I'm always asked, what's the impact of this debt? The thing that makes me worried is what happens if the interest rates start to rise, because as we know, interest rates today are as low as they've been at any time in 40 years, which is a great benefit to the economy. But if we start to see those interest rates rise, maybe by 300 basis points from, let's say, 2% on a 10-year Treasury bill to 5%, then the cost of borrowing in the United States government goes way up. And then it becomes, again, another story of a dog chasing its tail. We would pay more and more taxes, not for the services that we want, not, roads and bridges and schools and, police and our national defense. We'd be paying massive amounts of our taxes just to pay interest on the debt.
Before we wrap up with calls, I want to bring up something Senator McConnell, again, the incoming majority leader, said recently. Talked about something called regular order in the Senate, and this is part of the process that I wanted to talk about. He says this: many of my members are not used to voting for appropriations bills, these annual spending bills. But if we're going to pursue our agenda to push back against the bureaucratic overreach seemingly on steroids for the last 5 or 6 years, we need to put appropriations bills on the president's desk and make him make a choice.
Yeah, I think I agree with Mitch McConnell. One of the things we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years is the reason we had this big, what we called the omnibus, or I think they've called the cromnibus bill, which wrapped up almost the entire budget in one $1 trillion bill that just passed a couple of weeks ago, something like a 1,600-page bill that nobody read. That's no way to make a sausage, right? And that's no way to make a budget. And we ought to get back to the idea of individual appropriations bills that, I think there's supposed to be 11 or 13 of them, and you pass them individually, the defense bill, the transportation bill, the education bill, and so on, and you do this in a very thoughtful process. You send it to the president. He makes a decision about whether he wants to sign it or not. This idea of having massive bills all rolled into one that the president either has to sign or shut down the government, that's just no way to do business. I would add one other thing, that getting back to regular order also means bringing up individual items for not just on the budget, but anything, Keystone Pipeline or Obamacare or whatever it might be. Let's have a whole series of votes. And under Harry Reid, there weren't a lot of votes. He simply wouldn't allow a lot of these things to come up for votes. Now, whether you're a liberal or conservative or Democrat or Republican, I think we all agree to have these members of Congress stand up and say aye or no to these major issues is a way a democracy should work.
And we have one last call.
Yeah.
It's Mike from Newkirk, Oklahoma, independent. Hi, Mike. Mike, you there?
The way I see things are going right now. Now, I don't know with that Keystone. I think we touched on the Keystone enough, but I think the way we see things going is that Obama didn't say he'd veto that, and I guarantee that if Obama doesn't veto that, because I don't think they're going to have a veto-proof majority. If he doesn't, Obama's going to expect immigration reform or something. But the way I see it, that like the relief valve has been let off for Obama, because Republicans got the House and the Senate, and the Obama, the way with the economy, it's just going to get nothing but better. His poll numbers are going to get nothing but better. So unless the Republicans, it's like the health care bill. He's not going to let anything happen to that health care bill. He's going to veto it, and he's going to dare the Republicans to say, you want to play, the repeal game, put your own bill down on the table. So it's going to be time I think the pressure is going to be relieved from Obama, because he's going to say, you guys get the majority in both houses. pass some bills. Show me what you got. And
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. I think Republicans need to be the solutions party. They can't just, the last few years they voted no on a lot of things. Now they have to prove to the American people who just gave them a big vote of confidence with the blowout election where Democrats got wiped out all over the country. The people were saying to the Democrats, stop. Get back to what's important. Creating good paying jobs for Americans. I'm very bullish on the economy. I think we're going to have a good 2015. But the one thing that concerns, I think, a lot of people listening to the show is that Americans, on balance, haven't had a pay raise now in 6 or 7 years. And that means, inflation is starting to catch up with them. We've got to get back to job number one, which President Obama has said. Job number one has to be creating jobs. That means building the infrastructure, having Keystone Pipeline, getting rid of some of the worst features of Obamacare that destroy jobs. That should be our primary focus. And if President Obama and the Congress and the Republicans can get together on that, I think it's all to the positive on an economy that looks pretty good to me right now.
Steve Moore is Chief Economist at the Heritage Foundation here in Washington, D.C. Thanks a lot for your time and your insight this morning.
Pleasure to be with you. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, too. We're about halfway through this Sunday edition of the Washington Journal, and coming up in a couple of minutes, we will turn to the topic of sexual assault on college campuses. Our guest will be the president of the nonprofit group called 1 in 4. His name is John Foubert. And later, we will switch gears once again and talk to Jack Oman, who is president of the Association of American Editorial Cartoonists, to talk about the year in political cartoons. We will be right back.
Tonight on Q&A, Washington Post fact-checker columnist Glenn Kessler on his biggest Pinocchios of 2014 awards, given to politicians and political groups he believes made the biggest false claims this past year.
Democrats tend to get a little more upset at them because I think they have bought into the myth of the liberal media, and they kind of think that the media is on their side, whereas Republicans, they firmly believe in the myth of the liberal media, so they kind of expect that they're going to be, oh, it's a reporter from the Washington Post calling, they're not going to be fair to me. I kind of think, I hope that over the last 4 years, I've done enough back and forth, treated both parties with equal fervor, that people have now come to, grudgingly say, okay, you're someone we can do business with. I know that the Senate Majority PAC, which is affiliated with Harry Reid, they stopped answering my questions midway through the campaign season because they felt they were not getting a fair shake from me.
Tonight at 8 Eastern and Pacific on C-SPAN's Q&A.
New Year's Day on the C-SPAN networks. Here are some of our featured programs. 10 a.m. Eastern, the Washington Ideas Forum. Energy Conservation with David Crane. Business magnate T. Boone Pickens. Cake Love owner Warren Brown. And inventor Dean Kamen. At 4 p.m. Eastern, the Brooklyn Historical Society holds a conversation on race. Then at 8 p.m. Eastern, from the Explorers Club, Apollo 7 astronaut Walt Cunningham on the first manned spaceflight. New Year's Day on C-SPAN 2. Just before noon Eastern, author Hector Tobar on the 33 men that were buried in a Chilean mine. And at 3 p.m. Eastern, Richard Norton Smith on the life of Nelson Rockefeller. Then at 8 p.m. Eastern, former investigative correspondent for CBS News, Cheryl Atkinson, on her experiences reporting on the Obama administration. New Year's Day on American History TV on C-SPAN 3. At 10 a.m. Eastern, Juanita Abernathy on her experiences and the role of women in the civil rights movement. At 4 p.m., Brooklyn College professor Benjamin Karp on the link between alcohol and politics in pre-revolutionary New York City. And then at 8 p.m., cartoonist Patrick Oliphant draws 10 presidential caricatures as historian David McCullough discusses the presidents and some of their most memorable qualities. New Year's Day on the C-SPAN networks. For our complete schedule, go to cspan.org.
Washington Journal continues.
Well, you may remember, if you're a regular viewer, that earlier this year we visited all of the Big Ten colleges and universities around the country and interviewed presidents and other leaders at those universities. We've been doing a follow-up series these last few days of the year here. Yesterday we talked about college athletic programs. Tomorrow, the cost of college. Is it actually worth it? But today, the topic will be preventing sexual assault on college campuses. And our guest in Oklahoma City is Oklahoma State's John Foubert, who leads a nonprofit group called 1 in 4, which is dedicated to preventing rape nationwide and sexual assaults on college campuses. Good morning, Professor. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. It's my pleasure to be here.
Let's start with the statistic, which gets us to the name of your group, 1 in 4. Your organization does report that 1 in 4 college women have survived rape or attempted rape in their lifetime. 1 in 4 women in the military experience rape or attempted rape during military service. In that college realm, how did you determine the figure, the actual figure 1 in 4?
Well, there have been several studies over the last few decades that have found that 1 in 4 college women have survived either rape or attempted rape at some point in their lifetime. And the first of those studies was done by a woman named Mary Koss out of the University of Arizona in 1987, and she surveyed students on 32 different college campuses. About 5,000 students were involved, and when she looked at the data from the women, she found that 1 in 4 had experienced either rape or attempted rape since their 14th birthday. That study was then replicated in the 90s by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and then finally the Department of Justice, just within the last decade, published a study that was a random sample of students on college campuses throughout the country, again finding that 1 in 4 college women have survived rape or attempted rape, and at that point it was at some point in their lifetime. Now, one of the things we need to realize about that statistic is that it doesn't say 1 in 4 women are raped during college, which is one of the ways that that's sometimes misconstrued. But if you ask college women, have you ever experienced rape or attempted rape, and that could be in high school or it could be later in college, about 1 in 4 will respond yes.
So the natural question then would be, why is this happening, and is it your sense that it's happening more frequently than in years past?
Well, the data has been remarkably consistent since the 80s, and the 80s is when the first nationwide study was done. So I think it's been, unfortunately, remarkably consistent. We would hope that those numbers would go down.
And what are the causes? Why is this happening? What are the factors involved?
Well, there are many. I mean, obviously, as one might guess, the people who are perpetrating rape are primarily men. About 98% of rapes are perpetrated by men, but certainly not all men perpetrate rape, and we need to make that distinction clear. So why do they do it? I can tell you some risk factors for men to perpetrate sexual violence. One is that they consume, that they binge drink 2 or more times a week. And the second risk factor is that if they have a peer group around them who somehow supports men's violence against women, either through jokes or just cultural norms. And if you combine the binge drinking and the support from friends, an individual male is 10 times more likely to commit sexual violence than other men. And then there's certainly many other risk factors associated with perpetration, lower empathy and more impersonal relationships with women, believing that they are controlled or dominated by women, and that's something that threatens them.
I want to let viewers know how the phone lines will be broken up for this segment, which will go about 50 more minutes. The top line here will be for students. 202-748-8000 is the number. We have a line set aside for parents at 748-8001. Educators, 202-748-8002. And all others, it's 202-748-8001. 8003. Joining us from Oklahoma City is John Foubert, who is national president of this group called One in Four. He's also professor of higher education and student affairs at Oklahoma State University. And Professor, let's dig a little bit deeper into things, but let's start with One in Four. What is your group trying to do about this issue, and how much success do you think you're having?
Well, what we try to do, and we've been around as a nonprofit since 1998, what we try to do is to get as many of our educational programs that have a very strong research base to them out into colleges and into the military. And we believe that the way to responsibly prevent rape is to follow the data where it leads. And so we're very much a data-driven organization. So we've developed some educational workshops to provide to both colleges and the military that have been shown in published studies that have gone through peer review processes, in the case of our program for men, to lead to a 40% decline in sexual violence among high-risk men who see it, and for both of our programs for men and women to lead to increased what's called bystander intervention. So the willingness of someone to step in if they see a situation that could turn into a rape and attempt to stop it.
Before we get to calls, Professor, I want to go back to a piece of the series we did at the universities, the Big Ten, earlier in the year, where one of our hosts read to the Ohio State Provost. It was Joseph Steinmetz. It was a letter from a female student written to the newspaper about what she called and others call a rape culture on campus. I want to show that, and we can talk a little bit more.
There was a letter to the editor on Monday by Emily Pellegrino, first-year student at Ohio State University International Studies, and she writes, I've been a student at Ohio State for 6 going on 7 weeks, and already there have been 4, count them, 4 reported sexual assaults. She goes on to say that there's a rape culture and that it must stop. I understand the desire to let loose and drink it away, but just because you decide to get wasted doesn't mean that the rules all of a sudden don't apply to you anymore. Just because you're drunk and the girl you've been dancing with all night is drunk doesn't mean you get to have sex with her, or vice versa.
That's a wonderful statement. I think it actually summarizes the education that we continually need to do. And also that's what's critical in this is, again, is how we report out sexual assault on campus and in our surrounding areas. Again, this is a populated area. And I think she's hit the issue right on the head. I couldn't say it better myself about the need for this particular kind of education.
John Foubert, any reaction to what you heard there?
Well, I have a couple reactions. I think the woman who wrote the letter is surprised that there have been 4 reported rapes in, I guess, the first 6 or 7 weeks of the academic year. And certainly any rape that's reported is of concern. But one of my thoughts about that is that there are statistics would show that there are many, many, many more rapes occurring at a campus like Ohio State, or for that matter, most anywhere, than just a few in the first few weeks. I mean, if you take a look at the most reliable nationwide data, you have a rate of 5% of college women experiencing rape or attempted rape every academic year. So if that would translate into, let's say, a campus of 10,000 students, 5,000 of whom would be women, and if you take 5% of that figure, that would be 250 women every year. So, and that would be on a campus of 10,000 students. Ohio State, I believe, is around 40 or 50,000. So I think one of the biggest issues that we have is helping women feel comfortable enough, and men for that matter, who experience sexual violence, helping survivors to feel comfortable enough speaking with administrators, speaking with police about what happened to them, so that we can begin to get a handle on holding perpetrators accountable far more than we are now.
Let's get to our phone calls for John Foubert, who is in Oklahoma City. Robert, you are up first. Robert's a parent from Riverview, Florida. Welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you. Good morning. And I have a couple of issues. I have a son who is in a college. He's in a fraternity. I have a daughter that'll be going to college next year, and I want both of them to be safe. I want our daughter to be safe, of course, from sexual assault. I want our son to be free and from any false accusations. I've noted quite intensely the Rolling Stone case, and I think that the journalistic standards that were displayed there and the fact that an allegation once made, it brushes the alleged individual with a stigma that never goes away, whether or not it's justified or not. So, what's your organization doing to address the issues like, let's not make names of victims or alleged assaulters public until it's substantiated?
Robert, thank you for your question. John Foubert.
Well, there was certainly a lot in there. I think there's a societal belief that women are out there who simply get angry at a man and decide to throw an accusation of rape against him to somehow get even. And if you take a look at the data, that is really so unbelievably rare as to be almost not worth speaking about, although I think any topic of human behavior we can study. But if you take a look at the better data that we have, any kind of false report is extremely rare. The estimates are well under 10% in that case, and that would be well under 10% of cases that are actually reported to police, and then the police believe that there's something there that doesn't quite add up. Now, that doesn't change the fact that maybe a rape happened, maybe it didn't. There are also very, very few men who are actually held accountable through a campus conduct process or through the courts for a particular sexual assault that did not occur. And one of the things that prosecutors will tell you is that one of the hardest cases for them to win is a sexual assault case against a perpetrator. The real bigger issue here, I think, is that there's so many women out there who either won't report because they know of the attitude that was displayed by that caller, or they're hesitant to talk to the police about something that happened to them or to a campus administrator because they don't think they'll be believed. And so what is 1 in 4 trying to do about that? We're trying to educate the public and people on college campuses and the military that false reports are extremely rare, and rapes that do happen are extremely common. And we need to focus our energy on preventing rapes from happening in the first place.
Following up on what you just said, Nick Anderson wrote recently in the Washington Post about colleges. Here's the story. Colleges often reluctant to expel for sexual violence, with University of Virginia a prime example. He writes that as growing numbers of students report sexual violence, those who seek justice through internal channels at colleges are learning that even when allegations are upheld, school officials are still often reluctant to impose their harshest punishment on these attackers, and that's expulsion. What do you make of that headline and that lead?
Well, I have a number of thoughts on that. And actually, about 10, 15 years ago, I was an assistant dean of students at UVA, so I'm quite familiar with that culture. And I did find when I was on the administrative side of things, now I'm a faculty member, but when I was on the administrative side of things, a lot of my colleagues were very hesitant to not only have a case against a perpetrator, but moreover to expel a student for sexual violence, even though they would quickly expel students for cheating on an exam. So I think we need a cultural change among university administrators to realize that the worst thing a college can do to a student is to say, you have 4,500 other choices of where to go to college, but this isn't going to be one of them. And in the grand scheme of things, that is not a huge consequence. And certainly anything less than that for a crime of rape is unconscionable. So I think we need to do a better job educating university administrators about the trauma that's involved in rape, about how to decipher different cases that come before them, and what are some appropriate penalties. And hopefully work hand in hand with local police so that there's a concurrent process of adjudication through the criminal court system. system.
Let's hear from Joe now in Orlando. Joe's another parent calling in. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Hello?
Joe, we can hear you just fine. Can you hear us?
Oh, sorry.
Yes,
I'm sorry. I'm turning my intercom off. Thanks for taking my call. I've always heard a lot of reasons for rape, and one of the ones I've always maintained, I've been around a long time, is that some part of it is sex, but a lot of the educators it's always about power and control. And I was wondering, has anything ever been studied to find out just how much of it is about sex? And if it's about sex, who are the bigger perpetrators of it?
Thank you. Let's hear from our guest.
Well, I think there's some philosophical discussions out there about, is rape more about sex? Is it about power? Is it about control? And I think we need to pay attention to whose perspective are we talking about here. So if you're thinking about the perspective of a survivor, a woman who is raped by a man, her perspective on this is, well, it's very much about power and control. That perpetrator took control of my body when I didn't want him to. There are some men who commit violence against women who essentially have decided at the beginning of the evening, I'm going to have sex with X woman. And whether I get it consensually or not, I'm going to proceed. And so if you think about it, it's a crime that involves control and power over a woman that involves sexual behavior. So a little bit of a both and in that case, but I think we can't just say rape is about sex. I mean, it is a violent crime where one person decides to take control over another person's body.
Chris in Alabama writes via Twitter this morning about all this. As long as there are unsupervised college kids combined with alcohol, you will have sexual assault. We have a call from Michael as well from Ithaca, New York this morning. Morning, Michael.
Good morning. I welcome C-SPAN's coverage on this. I also want to thank everyone behind the cameras that put on C-SPAN every day, especially during these holidays.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Mr. Foubert, you bring a great wealth of experience, and I appreciate that. My name is Pastor Michael Vincent Crea. You can go to my website, One World Life Systems, where I've even protested outside of former Pope Benedict's window. Having left Cornell University, which actually dealt with this subject on a front page story in November, following up the president's rollout of the public service announcement this year, and also measures that have been taken up here, as well as being looked at in other Ivy League schools and other schools, like the woman down in Columbia University. What I would like everyone to start realizing, and I've been working on over 20 years, is that we need to deal with our constitutional congenital defects. Africans were not looked at as citizens until the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Women weren't looked at as invisible until 1920. I'm disabled from being raped in the New York Seminary after leaving Cornell and live with post-traumatic stress. I'm not a survivor. I call myself a violated reviver. Every day I have to live with this. Where I think we need to focus not with college educators per se. We need to focus that we have a First Amendment and everyone is free to practice their faith as they choose. My ministry is ecumenical. I work from A to Z, agnostic to Zoroastrian. I don't proselytize. I facilitate projects. What we need to do is teach our children at an early age everything not only about sex, but about human rights.
Comments there from Michael. While we hear from our guests, we'll take a look at the website that the guest just talked about, One World Life Systems. Go ahead, Professor Foubert.
Well, I think there are any number of issues that were brought up in the caller's comments. I think that we shouldn't just limit ourselves to one population when we're talking about educating people about sexual violence. We need to educate college students, people in the military, people in the general public who comprise our jury pools, and definitely I would agree that we need to educate our children. And I have 2 small children right now, one of whom's a 4-year-old boy, and one of the ways that I am beginning to educate him right now is, we'll often play tickle games or whichever, and if I'm tickling him and he says, Daddy, stop, I'll stop immediately, and I'll say, that's right. If someone says stop and they're doing something to your body, you say stop, they're supposed to stop right away. And so I think it's a wonderful lesson I learned from my mentor in graduate school. So I think that there are lots of ways we can educate people of all ages. And certainly I have deep sympathy for the caller's experience, and I'm glad he was willing to share it here on television.
We just talked about some colleges that might be reluctant to